Thank you very much for the invite. It's very nice to be here this morning. And being an economist in the world today is really it's probably the most exciting job because things keep on changing so much. Being an economist in South Africa is especially so. I mean, having politicians that say all these funny things that they say all the time and doing all these totally weird things really make life really exciting for an economist. But what I'm going to do this morning, I'm going to chat a little bit about the international economic environment, just touch on one or two highlights. Then I'm going to go to the South African economy, touch on maybe a little bit of politics and some economic numbers. And then I'm going to show you some very amazingly interesting demographic numbers that I've calculated recently. And if there is time, I will give you the best investment advice that you will ever get. So that's more or less what I'm going to do. Okay. Let me get to that one. I think that's the single most important narrative that we are currently experiencing globally, and that's the role of central banks, what central banks are doing. Now, the job of a central bank, and remember, central banks are fairly new animals. They were only created, most of them, less than 100 years ago, in fact. And what's the role of a central bank? And the role of a central bank, in the first instance, is to make money, quite literally. That's their job. Because we're not allowed to do that. They have a monopoly on this. If you make money on your photocopy machine, you're going to get into trouble. But they can do that. So that's the job of a central bank, to make money. And that's what they've been doing. But gradually over time, central banks started getting more and more powerful. And they started taking on more and more responsibility. And if you look what central banks do today, they are responsible for just about everything. And remember, we're talking about a few central banks, maybe 4, maybe 5 or so of the major ones internationally, and they make all these very, very important decisions about things like, for example, interest rates, and recently about more and more things, and it's got a massive impact on all of us. It's got a massive impact on the world financial markets. Now, like I said, they're responsible for everything, and they have decided, the world central banks, they have decided that we need low interest rates. Not only low interest rates, we need very low interest rates. Not only very low interest rates, we need interest rates below zero. And that's interest rates in Europe and in Japan and many countries in the world are below zero. And do you know what it means to have interest rates below zero? It means if a bank puts money at the central bank, they pay for the privilege to do this. And many banks in Europe are thinking of buying big vaults to put cash in there because they can't put the cash at the central bank because they're losing money. But that's not all. Central banks also decided that they're not going to reduce interest rates below zero, many instances, or very low. They've decided they're going to start getting involved in the rest of the yield curve as well. That's other medium-term and long-term interest rates as well. And what they've started doing recently, they give it fancy names, they call it quantitative easing. So they started printing money out of nothing. They give the money to the banks, and then they take in return from the banks something called government debt instruments. What they basically are doing, they're printing money and giving it to governments. That's what they're doing. And in the process, they're pushing interest rates down, medium-term and long-term interest rates as well. And today, more than half of total government debt that trades in Europe trades below zero. That also means that if you want to lend money to the German government, as an example, you have to pay them before they take your money. But the consequences of this is that if you manage a pension fund, as an example, that means that you are forced to invest in the most liquid instrument there is, and that's capital market instruments. But the return that you get there is a guaranteed loss. So pensioners will give you money, and the day they retire, they're going to get less back. That's the consequences of this exceptionally low interest rates environment that central banks have decided to create internationally. That's not all. I think it also adds to a lot of political, social tension. It also adds a lot of political tension globally, because what happens is that the guys, rich people like you, they get the benefit of very low interest rates. When interest rates go down, other financial market prices or instrument prices go up, like equities, for example. For that reason, we have equity prices at record high levels globally. And who benefits from that? Financial institutions, rich individuals, and the like. Who do not benefit from that? People that do not participate in the financial markets, and they are typically workers or the unemployed and people that are not part of this racket, essentially, that is happening on the world's financial markets. So you get this tension building up. between the haves and the have-nots, where the haves indeed are getting wealthier, while the real economies are not really growing. And I would argue that's the reason why we've seen something like, for example, Brexit. Because the Brits, it's not the Londoners, they get the benefit of this. But the rest of England, the rest of Britain, they don't see the benefits of this, and they don't like the establishment, which is seated, of course, in Brussels, as an example. And I would also argue the reason why we have funny people, like a guy with orange hair, perhaps becoming the next president of the United States, is also because of this. Because the way monetary policy is conducted internationally. So that is the monetary policy environment in which we find ourselves internationally. And I think what is likely to happen eventually is that we're going to see a significant correction on the world's financial markets. And I'm afraid to say, I think it's going to be quite painful. It's probably going to happen in some sort of financial market correction coming from the United States. So in very nice Afrikaans, I think there's a crash coming. Okay, and that's part of the reason. And also keep in mind, when economies go into a recession, you need at least 5% interest rates to catch your economy. So when the economy goes into a recession, you typically reduce interest rates by 5%. Interest rates are already at zero in many instances in Europe. So if they go into recession, what are you going to do? You don't have monetary policy as an instrument available anymore. Okay, so that's the international environment. Let's have a look at the local situation, one or two things. Let me just chat a little bit about politics. Now, to try to understand politics in South Africa, there's no way. I speak to international journalists all the time, and I speak to diplomats all the time, and I try to explain to them South Africa's politics. It's not possible. It's not possible to explain to anybody what's going on in South African politics, because you have to be born in South Africa to understand politics in South Africa. And then it takes many years to really to get behind this. But let me try to give you a bit of a summary in the way I understand politics in South Africa and why we do see some weird things happening in South Africa. It's important to know that we have a tripartite alliance in South Africa, which is the government in a way. And they have different histories and different ideological beliefs, and they come from somewhere else. And try to understand that in order to try to understand why they do some very funny things sometimes. Now, the most important one, of course, is the ANC, the African Nationalist Congress, and they were a typical liberation organization before 1994. And usually what happens when a liberation organization like this becomes the government of the day, they implement very socialist policies, and the result of that is usually very bad for the economy. You find it all over the place, especially in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. That is the normal, that's how things work. You get a liberation organization and they implement all sort of funny socialist policies. This did not happen with the ANC. They changed character completely in 1994, and the name for that is probably a new liberalist kind of political party. And that's the kind of policies that they implemented from 1994 as well. They liberalized the financial markets, they liberalized trade, they privatized, all that sort of stuff. Okay. But again, there was a change in the character of the ANC around about 2008, 2009. I called it the beginning of the Z period. From there was another change in the character of the ANC, but this time it's much more difficult to really pinpoint what they stand for. Because you get all sort of funny things. Is our macroeconomic policy plan, is it a national development plan, as an example? Or is it a national democratic revolution? Or is it a developmental state, whatever that means? We don't know. We don't know what the ANC stands for today. Additionally, what has happened, and it happened before, especially from 2008, we've seen this attack on many of our institutions in South Africa. Of course, we know South African Airways has been run into the ground. It happened before that. Eskom, you name it. But more importantly, institutions that are so important to a constitutional democracy, like, for example, the public protector, the way that she was treated by the president, even by parliament. Or our courts. Government is actually in contempt of court today. They simply ignored a court order last year. I'm referring to the Obashir. So clearly there's something is changed in the ANC, and it's happened especially in the recent couple of years. The role of COSATU's job is basically the marketing arm of the ANC. Now, as the marketing arm of the ANC, they're very well organized. The power base of COSATU is the shop floor, and it's the factories, and it's the mine. That's what it is. That's the power base. And you use COSATU to sell yourself, to market you, the ANC, is during elections, as an example. But within COSATU, some major changes took place recently as well. There was a lot of infighting. They kicked out a couple of guys, like, for example, Nzima Avavi. But the biggest trade union in South Africa, NUMSA, the Metal Workers Union, was also kicked out of COSATU. And suddenly if you kick NUMSA out and a couple of other trade unions, then the composition of COSATU changed, and it changed quite dramatically because the shop floor is not the power base for COSATU today, because 60% of COSATU members today are civil servants. So we have the civil service in government, with government, governing the civil service. It's just not sustainable. And it's got significant, a huge impact on things like the fiscal accounts, and I'll give you some numbers just now. The South African Communist Party is perhaps the most important role player in the tripartite alliance because they're the intelligentsia. Now, don't confuse that with intelligent. It's two different things. Their job is to provide the underlying ideological base to the tripartite alliance. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the theory there, but essentially the South African Communist Party, they may be communists. I don't think they understand their own ideology, but they are not Marxists. They are Leninists. And Lenin believed in the centralization of power. Marx said, no, the power must be with the people, with the Soviet. No, Lenin said, no, it must be centralized because people are stupid. That's what it is. You can't trust people. They don't know anything about politics or economics, and there are a bunch of saipgate, especially in Russia. That's where the first communist revolution happened. You can't trust the people. You need to centralize power. And that's the reason why we have something like cadre deployment in South Africa, because that's what the ANC teaches, the tripartite alliance, to centralize power, to have cadre deployments, to make sure you take over all the levers of power in the country. And that's why we have things like, for example, so-called state capture in South Africa. So that roughly is what we have in terms of politics in South Africa. The result of that is an ideologically confused government, contradictory policies all over the place, and weak political leadership. I'm not going to go through all these numbers. Maybe I can just touch on one or two of them. I should just touch on monetary policy. That's what can be expected in interest rates. I think interest rates are going to go up, but not by much. So expect an increase in interest rates, not by much. The Reserve Bank is one of those institutions that's still very, very well run. Very much independent, but there's an attack on the South African Reserve Bank. See what Jesse Jarty said recently. There's an attack on the banks in South Africa. We know what happened to this cabinet decision that wasn't a cabinet decision that nobody really knows. That's another example of weak political leadership. So there's an attack on the South African Reserve Bank, something that still works very well. Maybe incidentally, the South African financial markets, the financial part of the South African economy is really healthy. It's very well regulated. Our banks are of the healthiest banks in the world, probably. They're very expensive, I must add, and there's not much competition, but they're very well capitalized and very well looked after. Okay, so the Reserve Bank is likely to start increasing interest rates. And we have interest rates, the repo rate at 7%, which is nice and high, but unfortunately we have inflation also around about those sort of levels. But expect an increase in interest rates. This is just something that I need to point out to everybody. We know this, we've got all this everything must fall movement in South Africa. People, especially the poor and unemployed, are very unhappy. Now, if you really want to get the poor and unemployed very angry, this is what's going to happen with food prices. So food prices are likely to increase quite sharply, especially with the weak currency and the drought. And this is, I'm very, very concerned about this. And it can boil over in all sort of places. And then maybe just a quick comment about the currency, the exchange rate of the rand. The rand, this is a special calculation on the currency. Up means weak, down means stronger, and this is where we are at the moment. The point I want to make, the rand is not as weak as it was in the past. There were instances just after the financial crisis, after 2000, the Asian crisis, when the rand was weaker, and then in 1986, can you remember Pink Water Pistol, the Rubicon speech? The rand was weaker as well. Okay, so the rand is weak where it is. The rand is hugely undervalued. And one or two things will happen. Either the rand will appreciate, come back a bit, or we will have more inflation, or a combination of the two. And we already see some of this happening. Whenever the politicians say something, the rand goes weaker again, and it pulls inflation up with that as well, in a way. And the longer the currency remains at this level, the more this level becomes the correct level, in a way. It becomes part of the fundamentals, and then this undervaluation will gradually start coming back, in a way. But the point is, don't think the rand is only a one-way bet. In fact, if there's a downgrade, which I think is going to happen, and we will be downgraded. In fact, Moody's already put a couple of state-owned enterprises on negative watch this morning. We're probably going to see a downgrade. If that happens, the rand's probably going to take another knock, but a very, very weak currency, very cheap currency, as well as amazing returns that we get on a very liquid capital market especially, must make South Africa attractive. So even though I expect a downgrade and a currency weakening suddenly because of that, I will not be surprised if we see the currency coming back quite strongly because of speculative inflows. So I don't want a downgrade, don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily mean a rand going very much weaker because of a downgrade. Maybe I can just touch on economic growth as well, which is an important number. Then I want to share some of the interesting numbers that I've recently calculated. Now that's economic growth. Economic growth at the moment, very, very weak. We know the second quarter's economic growth was 3.3%, but if you compare the first 6 months this year to the last 6 months last year, and we do all these adjustments that we always do as economists, economic growth currently around about 0.2%, 0.3%, and that's likely to be for the year as well. So around between 0 and 0.5% economic growth, and there are a number of reasons why we have very weak economic growth in South Africa, but it's perhaps not a so-called technical recession, but in my book this is a recession because population growth is 1.6%. So we can't even maintain our current income on a per capita basis because the economy is just growing not fast enough. And if we want to reduce unemployment as well, we need to grow this economy around about 5% or so, and that's certainly not going to happen. Let me just show you some of the fiscal numbers. I mentioned that COSATU is part of the tripartite alliance. Now this is there's the Z period. There's the beginning of the Z period. You can see the numbers start looking differently. The red line is state spending as a percentage of GDP, and the blue line is state revenue, taxes, as a percentage of GDP. Now, we've seen a massive increase in state spending, the red line over there, and there are two reasons for that. I'll come back to that a little bit later in another context. The one is that we've seen huge increases in social spending generally, but what we have seen, especially in recent years, is a dramatic increase in the wage bill for civil servants. So there are many civil servants. They're hopelessly overpaid, and we've had huge increases in the salaries laws. And that is because of COSATU's role within the tripartite alliance. Now, there are many civil servants, let me just correct myself, many civil servants that are overworked and underpaid, but that's not the majority. And the most civil servants are between 40 and 80% on average better remunerated than the private sector equivalents. Which simply cannot afford this army of civil servants anymore. Okay, so that's a huge increase in spending. That's state revenue, and you can see state revenue is significantly came under a lot of pressure recently. The reason why we've seen a bit of an increase in state revenue in the recent years is, quite ironically, if you employ more civil servants and you totally overpay them, they also pay income tax. And the Minister of Finance, in a way, paid his own income tax. That's not all. They like to spend money on Kentucky, the civil servants. And they pay VAT on Kentucky, as you know. And you get, if you notice, there's always an empty Kentucky box outside the Department of... Anyway, so there's a gap between the two, how much they spend, how much we get in. Now check, whoops, sorry about this. Now check this. This is state debt levels. This is state debt levels in South Africa. And what I've done, I've looked at a couple of ministers of finance that we've had. Trevor Manuel took over in 1996 as Minister of Finance, when state debt levels were in excess of 50% of GDP. It took Trevor Manuel 15 years to bring it down to half that, to about 25% of GDP. Within 5 years, whoop, up back there at 50% of GDP. And that's one of the reasons we're going to see a downgrade. But the interesting thing is, we know there's this proxy war going on between Zuma and Pravin Gordhan. And everybody says Pravin Gordhan is going to save us from all sort of terrible things that's going to happen to the economy. See what happened when he was the Minister of Finance, what happened to state debt previously. Of course, it's not his fault. There are the commodity cycle and the global financial crisis and all things. But the reality is that state debt levels got out of hand while he was Minister of Finance. There we had in Klandla-Nene, state debt levels also went up at a slightly slower rate. And he's a guy that I really like as Minister of Finance. He's quiet and he falls off his chair every now and again. But he's technically very, very strong. And then we had the weekend special. He didn't have much time to make much of a change to the state level. And now Pravin Gordhan is back again. Is this not perhaps wolf in sheep clothing? I don't know. Anyway, so now let me show you some of the amazing new research they've done. That's a bit of a background on the South African economy. If there are any questions later, I'd love to take those. Economics is about numbers. I'll show you some numbers and graphs and formulas and theories and all that sort of stuff. But that's not what economics is really about. Economics is about one thing only. And really, it's only one thing that really, really matters, and that is people. That's all that matters. And the only reason we use graphs and these sort of things is because we want to understand people a little bit better. Now, I'm going to go through history. I'm going to tell you a story now. And I'm going to go back 100,000 years, and I'm going to tell you our story as people and how we evolved as people the last couple of 100,000 years. And I'm going to touch and I'm going to point out a few of these amazing economic breakthroughs that happened the last couple of years. Now, the reason why I start, and this is the storyline, it starts there, goes there, go down, and go over there. So I'm starting 100,000 years ago, and the reason why I start 100,000 years ago is because there's a cave in the Southern Cape called Blombos. And in this cave, the oldest form of abstract thinking or proof of our abstract thinking was found. So in a way, we became humans 100,000 years ago. In Blombos, in the Southern Cape. And that's where we all originated from. But imagine what life would have been 100,000 years ago. We lived in small groups, between 5 and 15 or so. We were hunter-gatherers. If you can kill something, you will eat it straight away. Because if you don't eat it straight away, somebody else will take it away from you, or some predator will take it away from you. And life was very, very tough. You need to move around as much as you possibly can, because in order to try to get food and try to get it away from predators and other things that want to use you as food. If you were lucky, 100,000 years ago, you could live to the ripe old age of about 25 years. And then you're really pushing things. That's where we were. About 60,000 years ago, round about there, a smallish group of us exited, went out of Africa, and we moved into the rest of the world, and we populated the rest of the world. When we went to Europe, as an example, we came across another Homo species called Homo neanderthalensis. And a couple of other Homos found further in the east as well. Another few groups left Africa, and some groups came back again. So 60,000 years ago, it was a major thing because we populated the rest of the world. And then the huge, big economic breakthroughs started to happen. About 15,000 years ago, one of the biggest economic breakthroughs was when we first domesticated animals. Now, the first animal that we domesticated probably was a wolf, or some people argue that the wolves domesticated us. It's called the dog today. But there are many other animals who also domesticated pigs and cattle and sheep and things like that. And that had a huge impact on us as people, because suddenly we start producing a huge surplus. And it changed our diet from less protein to more fat. And so this huge surplus allowed us to increase our population. And the groups increased to 50 or even 100 because we could. Because we have something called capital, the cattle. And for the first time in history, the concept of private property rights was gradually starting to come to the fore. So that a major economic breakthrough about 15,000 years ago. And then about 8 to 10,000 years ago, another major economic breakthrough, and that's when the first time that we domesticated plants, especially grain. Because now you can produce an even bigger surplus. The problem with plants is that they do not move around like animals. Means we have to sit around and wait for the harvest to get ripe before we can harvest that. And while we're sitting around, we can just as well start packing some rocks on top of each other and start building buildings, because the word civilization means tall buildings. And while we're sitting around producing this huge surplus, other people want to steal our stuff so we can actually afford it. Guards to look after our harvests, and that was the beginning of armies. And while we have a lot of people sitting around, gradually certain social groupings were also forming, like the workers, like the merchants, like the soldiers, like the priests, a religious class, and of course the rent seekers, the politicians, also started to appear approximately 10,000 years ago. And then things really start happening very fast. We started with record keeping. That made it possible to teach people things. So the boys will be sent to universities or to schools, and we will teach them. You don't need to remember. your grandmother's milk tart recipe anymore. You're just going to have a look on the clay tablet, what she said. And that was the beginning of the internet, in a way. And teaching and education became more important than possible. And some interesting experiments, like, for example, about 4,000 years ago, we started with something called democracy, which worked sometimes and we did not work sometimes. Some of the universities today in the world, about 1,000 years ago, we had other inventions and discoveries like electricity and combustion, internal combustion engines, and we had the Industrial Revolution. And then for the past 100 years, one of the greatest economic inventions ever happened. And that is when we started sending girls to school. Because think about this. Girls didn't go to school. Their job was to be at home, look after the kids. When you start sending girls to school, the strongest contraceptive in the world is how long girls go to school. So suddenly you send girls to school, they have fewer children. That's got a huge impact on the demographics of that particular society. Suddenly women became also well educated. They entered the job market and you double your workforce. And that's the reason why the American economy absolutely exploded in the 1950s and 60s, because they went through the bra-burning revolution. Women demanded equal rights. And that's why in societies where you don't make use of your women folk to work in a labor market, those economies can't grow at the same pace as other economies because you don't use half of your labor force. Now, what's going to happen in future? I don't know. What I do know is there's very interesting things happening. Things like, for example, who plays Pokemon Go? Anybody here? Pokemon Go is perhaps what the future holds for us. Pokemon Go is a mixture between the real world, where we sit and where we work and where we live, and the virtual world of these funny characters that you need to go and get all places. But in fact, we're already living in a virtual world. We try EFT is a virtual transaction that is happening. Sending emails is virtual things that's happening. Downloading software or music or reading a book, all of that is virtual because it all happens on computers. And you know, the future probably will also include the bigger, more frequent use of something called virtual currencies like Bitcoin. If we use Bitcoin, then we will transact between individuals. And if we can't transact between individuals, you do not need a financial intermediary. That means in future, we won't need banks, maybe. And if we don't need banks, why do you need central banks? We won't even have monetary policy anymore. We will transact with each other. It will be totally anonymous. Nobody will know that you and I are doing a transaction. And if nobody knows, nobody can tax that. So taxes will change completely. And the only things that can be taxed are physical stuff like property and heads like poll taxes. Because income tax will become extremely difficult because the Minister of Finance I will not give my password to him to tax me. So that's perhaps, so this virtual world, maybe the world will become more and more virtual. I'm just thinking what the virtual rugby teams will look like. Okay, that's a bit of a background. Now with that, I'm going to show you some interesting numbers. I'm going to have a look at some demographic changes that's been happening globally, and we're going to use this information for South Africa as well. Now, first of all, there are three variables, or three things that I need to explain. You get young people, and they are younger than 16 years. You get old people, they are older than 65 years. And you get the rest, or the in-betweeners, or the workers, whatever. So those are the three categories of people. And I'm going to calculate certain certain ratios now. So younger than 16, older than 65, and the rest. Okay, now let's have a look at some of these trends internationally. This is young people as a ratio of the in-betweens. This is Africa. In 1960, there were 0.8 children for every adult in Africa. It went up, and from about late 1980s, now it's starting to come down. This is the rest of the world, the purple one. There are 0.4 kids. They get small children. 4.4 kids for every adult in the rest of the world. and some other places. Like, for example, the European Union, they have about a quarter child. They even have smaller kids in the European. So they've got a quarter child for every adult in the European Union. The point is, in all instances, it's coming down, and it's coming down because people are getting fewer kids. Okay. Now, this is just by certain countries. That, for example, is Uganda. They have more than one kid for every adult, and a couple of other countries. The red one, for example, is Japan. And you can see that it just keeps on falling and falling. Japan, as an example, has got 0.2 kids for every adult. Okay, remember that one. I'm going to show you something else just now. Okay, now we're going to have a look at old people. How many old people do you have as a ratio of the in-betweeners? And everywhere in the world, it is going up. Africa is very low, but it's also gradually going up. So, for example, that's the European Union. They have 0.3 old people. In the case of Japan, I think I've got specifically Japan, they have 0.45 old people in Japan for every adult. They have 0.2 kids. They sell more adult nappies in Japan than baby nappies. Because they have got all these old people in Japan. All right, that's some countries, specific countries in the world. And if we put all of them together, the young ones and the old ones, this is what it looks like globally. That's Africa again, pretty much the same trend because we have very few old people in Africa and some other countries in the world. But the interesting thing is you will find at the end here, in all instances, the trend, it's turning. It's going up because the world is gradually in a transition period moving where most of the dependents are kids to a period where most of the dependents will become old people. The world is getting older. That's the point that I'm making. Okay. Now let's have a look at population growth, some places in the world. Population growth globally, well, in Africa, roughly around about 3%. That's Africa mostly here. The rest of the world over here, down about 0, in many instances below 0. A very interesting thing is that countries typically will get wealthy, and then once they become wealthy, population growth slows down quite dramatically. I'm going to show you some of the graphs on that as well. In most instances, not in all instances. Like, for example, China is going to be the first country in the world where population growth will turn negative before they've grown wealthy, the Chinese. And that's because of specific policies that they have there. Another country that is actually in negative population growth at the moment, but their life expectancy is quite low, is Russia. Life expectancy is around about 55. And the reason for that is because they drink themselves to death. That is really the reason. They've got a major alcohol problem, the Russians. But most of the trends is population growth significantly lower. There's an interesting one. Check that one. That is Spain. What happened in Spain? What happened in Spain is that they became part of the European Union, or that was the creation of the European Union. And all the Poles went from Poland to Spain because they had this huge construction boom in Spain. And there's a huge increase in the population. And then the population, the construction, the property bubble burst in Spain, like everywhere else in the world. And all of the Polish left Spain and they went to Britain, to London. And that's when the Brits decided, no, we're going to vote for Brexit. So that's the reason, part of the reason why the Brits left the European Union. But mostly, generally, the trend for population growth is down, and in many instances, it is negative. This is just some regions in the world, population growth in Africa, population growth for the world, 1.2%. And South Africa's population growth is currently about 1.6% or so. Okay, now there's a longer-term trend for world population. There's Africa's long-term trend, and what I've done, I've just used some statistical techniques to make a prediction on what's going to happen to the world. There's the world, and by the year 2070, world's population growth will be down to 0. World's population growth. And if it hasn't been for the fact that people will live longer and longer and longer, in 100 years' time, there would have been less people on this planet than what we have today. Think about that. The only reason why there are going to be more people is because people take longer to die. We live longer. Africa, population growth, the same sort of thing, but Africa's population growth will stay much higher for much longer. So if you want to do business, Africa is the place to be. Because you need people to do business. Interesting thing I've picked up, is there one single number that I can use as a proxy to describe the level of development of a country, of a society? And that single number is life expectancy. And the interesting thing is there's a magic number of around about 75. Between 70 and 80, if life expectancy of a community reaches between 70 and 80, then suddenly population growth collapses. For example, it happened in Germany. Let's see what happened to population growth. Japan, there, population growth. North America. So that 75 years seems to be a trigger point in any society. In terms of, I'm just giving you some tools because I'm going to use some of these numbers a little bit later to make some calculations on South Africa. Okay, now I'm going to have a look at South Africa's numbers. And I'm going to do it in the typical South African way, and that is I'm going to look at our numbers in racial terms. But before I get to that, I just have to share something with you. My daughter is a geneticist, and my daughter helped me to have my genome analyzed. So I have a proper map of my genome. I have had it analyzed, and I know if I'm predisposed to certain genetic illnesses, as an example, and all sort of weird things. Everything about who you are is written in your genome. Now, let me share. We're going to have breakfast a little bit later, so my apologies for this example. But in my genes, it tells me that I have the capability of smelling asparagus in somebody else's urine. I can do that. And apparently, I've never tried that, I must admit. I don't know what the practical value of that is, but apparently I can do that. And apparently it's quite scarce. So that's interesting. But something more interesting, I know where I come from because I can see that in my genome. And I can tell you this morning that I am from mixed racial descent, making me technically a colored. So I'm a colored. But that's not all. I also know that 3% of my genes comes from Homo neanderthalensis. I'm not only a colored, I'm also a hybrid. I'm a mixture of two species. Now imagine if I go to, and I've been to the university recently at Gibson, and I had to fill in a form about my racial stuff and all that. And I told them, but I'm not even other. I'm a total different species. I'm a mixture of species. And that really caused quite a lot of havoc. Okay, so that's just my background. So I'm going to have a look at some of South African numbers on a racial basis. I'm going to refer to the races as black and white and colored and Indian. Now, if anybody have got a problem with that, tell me and I will change it to 1, 2, 3, and 4, or A, B, C, and D. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, this is not about race. But I'm going to use the racial numbers that I have available just to share with you where we are as South Africans, and hopefully to take the sting out of race a little bit as well. So it's important to when you talk about stuff, let's at least know what we're talking about. Okay, now there's the life expectancies of the different races in South Africa, where we are today and where we're going to be in the year 2060. Black life expectancy today in South Africa, as an example, on the left side, is about 57 years, and they're likely to be 75 years in the year 2060, and some of the other races. Let me just rush a little bit because I'm running out of time. 80% of the racial composition in South Africa today is black. 85% will be black in the year 2060, and there are some of the other races. Whites currently just over 8%, they will be less than 5. Indians 2.5 now will be less than 2. Coloreds more or less the same in the year 2060. That is what the racial composition will look like. This is what I call a wave. This is very important. A wave is when you look at the poor community, you will find there's a lot of kids, typically, fewer old people, older people, and very few old people. And gradually, as the society becomes richer, like I've explained to you, the number of kids will get fewer, and the number of old people will get a little bit more. And gradually, there's a wave, like a bulge developing in the middle of the society. And that's a lot of workers. And you get eventually a sweet spot. It's called the population dividend. We have a lot of workers and few children and few elderly people. And that's exactly where the Chinese are today. They've got a lot of workers, very few children, very few old people, and that's why the economy is cooking. And that's where the Japanese were in the 60s and the 70s. And that's why everybody thought the Japanese were going to take over the world in the 60s and the 70s. It didn't happen because this wave washed through the Japanese population, and today they're old. So there you get this wave. Now, this is the raw data of the different racial groups in South Africa. Now, let me put it on a graph, and this is what it looks like. This is a black data in South Africa. A lot of kids, relatively few potential workers, and a lot of few old people. So it's pretty much a straight line. We do not see a wave in the black community. If you look at the colored community, there's bit of a bulge building up there, but it's still pretty much a straight line. If you look at the Indian, there's some beautiful wave in the Indian community. So clearly looking at the Indian community, there's a nice wave in the Indian community. And only looking at this graph, one would expect the Indians to be doing quite well. You look at the white community, the wave is pretty much already on its way through the community. So clearly whites as a group are getting older. Okay, that's the basic information. But that's, of course, not all that really matters. You have to look at your dependents as well. Now, I'm going to make some fine-tuning to this data or to these statistics. Dependents are young or old, but that's not all. Imagine you live in a household and there's an adult in this household that is unemployed. It is like having an extra child. It's an extra dependent in your household. Imagine also there's an adult in your house with a post-matric qualification. Somebody with a post-matric qualification's income is at least double that of somebody without a post-matric qualification. So it's like having an extra worker in your household to have somebody with a post-matric qualification. So those two variables, apart from old and young, I'm going to make some adjustments for unemployment and for qualification. Let's see what it's going to look like. Now, this is just the unemployment levels. And unemployment for blacks and coloreds, very much higher than, for example, Indians and for whites. Whites' unemployment levels are very, very low. And for all practical purposes, it is at 0. Now, that is the qualifications for the different races. The qualifications for whites is very high. About 50% of whites got the post-matric qualifications. Indians are going up very, very sharply. The other two racial groups, there's been some improvement, but the qualification levels are still very, very low, at around about 10% or so. Now I'm going to start making the adjustments. This is the normal dependency ratio for blacks. In 2002, for example, a lot of kids, gradually fewer children, and this is the dependency ratio, kids and old people, dependency ratio for the black community in South Africa as it is today. When you adjust this for unemployment, remember the scales of all these graphs are not exactly the same. There's a sharp increase in the dependency ratio for blacks. So that's a major problem for blacks, high levels of unemployment. If you adjust this for qualifications, there's a bit of an improvement, but hardly, because the post-matric qualifications are still very low. Now, my theory is that as the dependency ratio goes down, your income will go up. So let me test that. Dependency goes down, income goes up, whoop, my theory holds. Let's check it for the Indians or for the coloreds. Pretty much the same, dependency ratio falling. If you adjust that for unemployment, it goes up a lot because of high unemployment levels amongst coloreds. If you adjust that for qualification, it comes down a little bit, hardly, because qualifications are still quite bad. And if you test the numbers, dependency ratio coming down, income goes up. But the interesting thing about coloreds is that their income seems to have slowed down a little bit in recent years. But the theory still holds. If you do that for Indians, you can see that dependency ratio start looking different from the other racial groups. So it's still coming down. It's gradually wanting to go up there because Indians also getting older. If you adjust that for unemployment, it hardly goes up because the unemployment levels are very low. Remember that the slides, the graphs are not exactly the same. And if you adjust that for qualification, it comes down very nicely because they've got a very good qualifications. And if you test my theory, that's what happens. And the Indian income is just rocketing. They're doing very well in terms of income. If you check the whites, looks completely different because they're getting very old as a group. If you adjust that for unemployment, there's hardly a change there. And if you adjust it for qualifications, quite a dramatic improvement on the white dependency ratio because they have very, very good qualifications. If you test that against income, dependency going down, income goes up, and the white population doing very well as far as income is concerned. But recently, the white income is gradually slowing down. Okay, that's where we are on the different races in South Africa. Now, that's just a total for the total of South Africa, and I just summarized everything in there. Now I'm going to have a look at income in South Africa, and before I get to that, let me just show you the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient tells you if it's measured between 0 and 1. If your Gini coefficient is at 0, it means everybody gets exactly the same income. If your Gini coefficient is at 1, it means one guy gets everything and nobody else gets anything. All right, so it's obviously in between somewhere for all the different community, for the community. This is a black Gini coefficient, much higher than, for example, the white Gini coefficient. The white Gini coefficient is low, and it is falling typically what one would expect in a wealthy community and a wealthy society. the black Gini coefficient is high and it remains high, typically what one would expect in a poorer society. But there are two additional factors in the black community. The one is that 80% of civil servants are black and they are hopelessly overpaid. And the rest are without jobs. High unemployment, without jobs. The guys with jobs are civil servants, or many of them, pulling the Gini coefficient very, very high. Secondly, of course, there's a factor called black economic empowerment, and few blacks get all the benefits from BEE stuff, and that also pulls up the Gini coefficient quite high. But that's a Gini for the different racial groups. I've calculated GDP per capita. Let's call it income. It's not really income, but let's call it income for black GDP. And I've adjusted, this is GDP per capita, for US dollar terms, adjusted for purchasing power parity. If you're not confused, don't worry. All right. Black income about 10,000, white income about 60,000, 6 times higher than blacks. Colored income about just over 10, and Indian income about 30. So that's where the different income of the different racial groups in South Africa are. It's changing, and it's changing quite dramatically. This on a per capita basis. I'm going to compare the different races in South Africa's income with other countries in the world. I looked at the blacks in South Africa and compared them with blacks in sub-Saharan Africa. In the year 1996, blacks in South Africa's income was more than double that of blacks in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is coming down. And today, it's about 1.8. So blacks in South Africa are slightly below twice the income in terms of, compared to the rest of black sub-Saharan Africa. That's just a comparison with Nigeria. On the right-hand scale, the red one, blacks in 1996 in South Africa's income was more or less the same as blacks in Zimbabwe. And today, South African blacks are 5 times better off than the Zimbabweans, because the Zimbabweans destroyed their own economy. That's the reason for that. We know that. Okay, that's a black. Indians in South Africa's income today, or in 1996, was 8 times that of the average Indian's income in India. And today, it is about 5 times the average. So it's falling, despite South African Indians getting better off, but the Indians in India, the Indian economy is absolutely cooking. They're growing very fast, that economy. That's the economy I really like. Whites, I'm comparing whites to New Zealand and Australia and Canada and England, the old Commonwealth countries. Whites in South Africa about 1.4 times better off than whites in those countries. But if you adjust it for normal market exchange rates, they are about 0.6 times. In other words, worse off than whites in those countries. So what we see here is the exchange rate of the currency. So essentially, whites in South Africa has got an amazing living standard because of the weak currency. But if you move and go and live in another country like New Zealand, you will have to make a significant adjustment to your living standards. That's essential. So it's better off for whites to be here. It's cheap to live here, and it's going to be very expensive to go to New Zealand, as an example. Ask the guys that's gone there. Okay, what's this mean for us? What's wrong with blacks? What's wrong with blacks? There are too many dependents. With that, I don't mean children. I mean it's a combination of those 4 factors. We need to improve the skills development for black girls especially. That's the answer. That's the answer. And it's going to take a long time, because that's the key. That's the key of developing a society. It's to start with girls. Of course, the boys as well. But the impact of educating girls on a society and demographics is huge. We have to give them access to jobs. The best way to get a good job is to get a job. That's the best way of getting a good job. We have to remove all obstacles in the way of getting jobs. BEE is certainly hurting in terms of the Gini, and the civil service is certainly hurting in terms of the Gini as well. Colours, what's wrong with colours? Colours is a problem, because I can't really make conclusions about colours, because colours is not a race, it's sort of a default race. If you're not either white or black or Indian, you're coloured in South Africa. There is no coloured race, really. And so the statistics, I believe, about so-called coloureds are, I can't really make a conclusion about it. I think that's a major issue if we really want to understand coloureds as a community. I think most of the issues are pretty much the same as blacks, but there's an additional problem with coloureds in that they're probably not black enough. They don't get the benefits of BEE or the same sort of benefits as BEE. What's wrong with whites? They're getting older. They're trying to postpone the inevitable of getting older by having very good qualifications, higher unemployment, and of course the weaker currency sort of maintaining a relatively good living standard. What's wrong with Indians? Nothing. The Indians are absolutely on the sweet spot. The Indian community. All the numbers point this out. Their unemployment levels are amazing. Qualifications are going up. Income is going up. And this whole population dividend, they are absolutely at the sweet spot. So if you want to do business in the future, if you want to sell BMWs to somebody, the Indian community is the place to start selling them. Because they're the guys, and if you want to sell nappies, you go and sell it to the white community. That's what it is. So the Indian community is absolutely the sweet spot, and everything works fine for the Indian community. Okay, maybe before I just end up with this racial thing, it's actually not about race in the end. Because what really matters, it's clear, is that what we need to have the emphasis, if we want to, as a community, become rich, we have to have the emphasis at the right place. And it's not about the race really anymore. It is about poverty, and it's about especially starting this whole process of making a community rich and start at the right place, and that's with your children, especially with your girls. And then, even after we do everything right, it's going to take at least 2 generations before you start off with a poor community and before you have professional women in that specific community. That's what it is. That's the reality of us, of human beings. Now, if I have time, I don't have time anymore, I guess. Am I done? That's just on my best advice, investment advice, and where you can put your money, where I believe is the best place to put your money. So I'm not going to go there. Maybe just a last comment what I want to make. South Africa is really an amazing place to be. We've got crazy politicians with all sort of funny political shenanigans. It's got a massive negative impact on things like, for example, the exchange rate of the currency. But we've got institutions that still work very well. The Constitutional Court recently, I think that was an amazing finding by the Constitutional Court, saying that the president is actually in contravention of his oath of office. The Constitutional Court, and I don't like all the judges. Some of them can't drive well and so on, but it's independent. The South African Reserve Bank is independent. Our financial markets are very well regulated and very liquid and very much integrated with the rest of the world. And that's actually the official opposition in South Africa. And we are part of Africa, a strong growing region, part of the developing world, part of BRICS and all those sort of things. We just need proper political leadership, and then we're probably going to cook. Thank you very much for listening.